Hey guys, I hope you guys are enjoying the quarantine as best as you can. However, we talked about this at the last couple of meetings about, being a scout is being a leader. And being a leader is not just in your community or in your scout troop or even in your school. It encompasses all of those together. And one of the things that we have to do is we have to establish a path or help the ones that are coming behind us so they can be leaders as well. Now, you all remember this when you guys were as Cub Scouts, you were coming up, and the older scouts, the Webelos would help with the wolves or the bears, and so we're going to do the same thing as scouts of Troop 333. And one of the things that we're going to do is, as the troop, we are going to make a presentation, or I'll say you guys are going to make a presentation to some Cub Scouts. And we'll divide that up into two sections. Some of us will be making some presentations to some wolves and bears, and then some of us will be making some presentations to the Webelos. But now this entire presentation is going to be solely developed by you guys. You guys are going to make the presentation. My job here is just to kind of help you understand what a presentation is. How do you prepare for that? How do we develop this presentation, so that you can present it? We're going to talk about how to manage that presentation. Once you figure out what the components of a presentation are, how do you actually make the presentation to a group? So that's the purpose of this. Now, like I said, part of your role as a scout is to be a leader. And one of the things that we learn in the scout law is that a scout is helpful. So how do we do that? How do we actually how do we teach people to be helpful? Well, we're going to talk about in this presentation is you guys are going to actually create a presentation on the Scout Oath and the Scout Law, and how do they actually apply to us as young men and young women in society today? And how does being a scout, how can you take the Scout Law and the Scout Oath? How can you apply that to your everyday life so that we can become better people, better scouts, better brothers and sisters, and better sons and daughters within our community? So that's the crux of the presentation that you're going to do. So you already know the content of the information. You know what the Scout Oath is, and you know what the Scout Law is. But now we're going to actually take that and put that into a practical application so that younger scouts can learn from you, learn all the things that you were taught, how you can pass that on to make them a better young men and young women in our community, because they're up and coming leaders just as you are. So that being said, the best way to do this is for you to do a presentation, to hear it directly from you, not from us leaders, but from scouts, because you were the bear and the wolf and the Cub Scout at one time. You were the Webelo. You're the one that crossed over through the Arrow Light ceremony. And these are experiences that you can give firsthand knowledge. You can give your own personal experiences and how that can help them develop their way as they negotiate scouting, whether it's as a Cub Scout or when they cross over into a troop. And the being a presenting a presentation is the best way for you as a scout to learn the material, because you can't teach something that you don't know. But then also, it gives you hands-on experience. You actually can form the new leaders in scouting for tomorrow. So you can have a direct connection and a direct hand in the formation of these leaders. So, well, let's get started. So if you're going to do a presentation, I guess we need to define what a presentation is first. So a presentation is basically a form or a means of communication, a way of talking or discussing something, or actually giving something to somebody, saying, "Here, let me show you this." In way that, as an individual, the way that you can communicate a particular portion of information to an audience or a group of people or an individual. And you really have two basic functions when you're making a presentation. And that is, either you want to provide them with some information or you want to persuade them to do that. Now, when have you experienced that? Well, we could think of a bunch of things. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about it in scouting. At some point in time, you were introduced to scouting. Either your parents brought you to a Cub Scout meeting, or you came to a troop meeting. And through the information that was presented to you, either about scouting or what you witnessed at the troop or at the pack, that information, first, you learned more than what you knew when you walked in there, number one. But number two, it persuaded you to say, "Hey, that's something that I think I need to be a part of, or I would like to be a part of." So then you said, "Mom or Dad, I'd like to be a Cub Scout, or I'd like to be a Boy Scout." So that's the purpose of a presentation. You either want to educate somebody, or you want to persuade them to a specific idea or a particular way of thinking. Now, remember when we did shooting sports a couple of weekends ago, Mr. Gary and I did a presentation over the course of a couple of meetings on gun safety, the rules of the range, how you handle weapons. We talked about the requirements for the merit badge, and we talked about what the qualifications were. Well, part of that, we did both in our presentation. One, we wanted to educate you. We wanted to teach you gun safety. We wanted to teach you the nomenclature or the parts of the weapons that you were going to be shooting. We wanted to educate you on what the Boy Scout requirements were for that. But we also wanted to persuade you to follow the safety rules, because we didn't want you or us or anybody else to get hurt, and we wanted everybody to have a great time when we're out there shooting, because we all had a great time shooting. But we had to persuade you the importance of being safe. We had to persuade you on the importance of knowing the safety rules and knowing the parts of the weapons that you were going to shoot and knowing what you were going to be doing. So that's what a presentation is. We're going to educate somebody, or we're going to persuade them. Hey, we even may do both in one setting, depending on what you're trying to, what your presentation is about. So we can't just jump up there and start talking about something. The Boy Scout motto is "Be prepared." So what does that mean? You have to be able or ready to do something, whatever that situation is, whether it's camping, starting a fire, putting up a tent, cooking, making sure that you keep your mind and your body physically fit and morally straight, right? We talk about that at the beginning of every meeting. So when you do a presentation, you do the same thing. The first step in before you can even consider doing a presentation is being prepared. So let's talk about that. What do we do when we prepare? Well, the first thing that you have to do is recognize that if you're asked to give a presentation like you're being asked to do with the younger scouts, consider that to be an honor. It's not a chore. It's not, you got to go out there and make this presentation, and you're like, "Oh man, I don't want to do that." It's an honor because somebody has recognized that you have a certain level of knowledge or expertise in a certain subject matter, and they need you based on your expertise and education that you have demonstrated, or your knowledge of your understanding of that topic. They have decided that they need you to present it, you based on your abilities. So it's an honor when you get asked to make a presentation or be a part of a group that is presenting. So now that we understand that it's an honor and it's not a chore, it's not just a job that we're going to be doing. Let's start preparing that. So when we start looking at this, the first thing we have to do is step number one in preparation is determine the context of what our presentation is. So what do I mean by context? Well, there's three basic things that I want you to understand about our context. Number one, we need to know when and where we're going to do this presentation. And is this going to be, am I presenting to a group of people or just an individual? Am I making a video presentation like I'm doing today? Or am I creating a handout presentation? Am I just creating the academic outline of it and I'm just going to hand that out? What kind of presentation am I doing? And do I need to have certain technology equipment, or will there be certain kind of technology equipment available for me? Or am I just going to get up there and am I going to be speaking? Am I just going to, we call that lecturing. And that's what if you can remember when you're in school and your teacher gets up there and they tell you about a certain subject and you don't have to do anything but listen to what they're saying, then that's a lecture. Or is this going to be an interactive presentation? And what I mean by that are you going to tell them something and then have them do something? Like, are you going to say, I'm going to teach you this information and then I'm going to test you on that we're going to do some practical stuff. Sort of like we do in Scouts, here's an example of that, knot tying. When we do knot tying, we teach you about knot tying. We tell you about it. We demonstrate it for you. But then guess what you have to do? You have to show that you know how to do it. So there's a practical exam. We ask you to demonstrate that for us by tying those knots, whether it's lashings or half hitch or square knot or a bowline, whatever those knots are, we're asking you to do that. So once you determine what the context of your presentation is, so just kind of a general understanding of what it's going to be, the second thing that you need to do is, what is your role as the presenter? Are you going to be teaching or presenting by yourself? Are you going to be presenting or facilitating? So what does that mean? What am I trying to say? Well, when you present, you're up there and you're teaching. You're the person that's providing the education. You're telling them what the subject is. You're giving them all the research. You're giving them all the knowledge about it. So you're teaching them. A facilitator is somebody that doesn't necessarily teach everything. They just kind of get everything started, and then the group will teach itself. So here's an example of a facilitator. A facilitator may come and get here's a better example. Zach, when we plan our meals, Zach will get up there and facilitate that discussion. He'll say, okay, guys, what do you want to do for lunch, breakfast, lunch, and dinner when we go on campouts? And then each of us will say, oh, well, I want scrambled eggs and bacon. And we'll say, well, we can't necessarily make bacon, or we can make bacon. And then there's a discussion. So the facilitator just kind of leads you in that direction, not necessarily teaching you anything. So you have to understand what your role is, so you know how to create or how to develop the presentation that you're making. So now that you figured out that what you're going to be doing in your presentation, the next thing that you want to do, the third step, is what are you trying to teach? What is your intended message? So again, are you educating? As we said in the beginning, are you teaching a new skill, or are you providing some information that the audience that you're speaking to just did not have prior to your presentation? Or are you trying to persuade them? So here's a good example. I want to persuade you to tell you that regular M&Ms are better than peanut M&Ms. And here's all my evidence. Here's all of my reasons why milk chocolate M&Ms are 100% better and you should only eat milk chocolate M&Ms as opposed to peanut M&Ms. And then if I'm giving you a persuasive presentation, that's exactly what I'll do. I'll show you all of this research, or if there's any data on there. I might even bring M&Ms and say, here, try these. Now try these, and this is why, because you don't have to worry about peanut allergies and so forth and so on. So you have to understand that when you're giving your presentation to somebody, you need to know what the message is. What are you trying to convey? Again, is it educational based, or is it a persuasive argument? That'll be determined by you. So in our case, we're going to actually do both, or you guys are going to actually do both. When you go and make your presentation to the PAX, you're going to educate them on what the meaning of the Scout Law is, or what the meaning of the Scout Oath is, okay, and why that's important. And that's where the persuasive part comes in, is the why. This is why it's important to be trustworthy, to be loyal, to be honest, to be thrifty, to be helpful. And what does that mean? So you're not just getting up here and saying, here's the Scout Law, here's the points of the Scout Law, here's the Scout Oath. We could write that down on a piece of paper and give it to them, but we're trying to persuade them that it's important that they live by those. And here's an example, because you're the example. You're what the Scout Law is and what the Scout Law represents. You're living that every day. So remember, we're going to go back over this in just a minute, but always you have to know what your message is. So the fourth step in preparing for that is, what are the methods or method of your presentation? Okay. So is it going to be formal or informal? So formal would be, there's PowerPoints and podium, and you're going to stand up there, and they're going to be, sitting in a structure where they have to take notes. It's very regimented, just like you would in school. That's formal. Or is it informal? Are we going to sit around a campfire, at a fire bowl of some sort, and you're going to teach your presentation then? What setting is it going to be in? Again, is your audience are you going to require that your audience have some kind of participation in that, in your presentation? Or are they just going to listen? Is it just a lecture? Is it just something where you're going to talk? Again, are they standing or sitting? And if they're sitting, how are you going to arrange that? Is it going to be like at our Scout meetings, where it's a horseshoe, where there's three sides, it's like a big U, and the instructor stands in the middle? Or is it just a classroom style, where there's just rows and rows of people? That's sometimes referred to as a stadium seating. And then again, are you going to need to do PowerPoint presentation, or are you going to show a movie, a video? Are you going to ask your participants to come up and write on the dry erase board? Are you going to write on the dry erase board? Are you going to hand out slides? So if you do a PowerPoint, are you going to do handouts where they can follow along? As you remember, when I taught the American Cultures Merit Badge, the guest lecturers, Father Peter, who came in and told you about Nigeria, he brought information from Nigeria. Same thing with Mr. Idy from the Philippines. He told you, and he brought you information from the Philippines. So, as well as who can forget Zach's mom when she brought all the snacks for us to try. That is something that you have to consider when you're doing your presentation. Am I going to need those things? So what methods are you going to use during your presentation? And that is something that, you have to know before. Obviously, you have to know before. The fifth aspect are there going to be any impediments, and what can you anticipate? So what do I mean by impediments? Are there going to be any obstacles during your presentation? So the first one the first one of the impediments you should consider is, are there going to be any cultural differences? Now, remember, when I taught the American cultures merit badges, different people from different cultures, things mean different things, such as we learned from the Philippines that in that culture, the grandparents are the head of the family. So when you're making your presentation, if your presentation is about, hey, I want you to buy this, or I want you to be a part of this, you may need to tailor that presentation towards the grandparents if they were, of Asian descent, because in the Asian culture, the grandparents are the head of the family. So you don't want to offend anybody based on their cultural differences other than yours. You may be of one cultural descent and they're of another, and you don't want to inadvertently create some kind of animosity just because you're not aware of the differences. So, are there any known prejudice or biases? So, again, with same thing with your cultural differences, we're mainly talking about the audience. Are you going to be presenting to a group of individuals or an individual that may already have a certain belief or understanding about something? Here's an example. We may be trying to recruit girls into our troop. Maybe that's something that we do in the future. And most young ladies aren't aware that they can be a part of either the pack or the scouts. They may think that they may have this prejudice that says, I can only be a part of the Girl Scouts. So you have to be aware of that so that you can address that adequately when you're making your presentation. So what about language barriers? So we talked about, and this is all in the cultural differences and biases. Or if you go to school and you're trying to persuade or give a presentation about the Scouts, a recruiting presentation, and you might be presented with a person from another country that doesn't speak English, and they're not going to understand what you're trying to tell them. So you have to be aware of that. And if you know that you're going to have some individuals or an individual in your audience that may not speak English, you have to be able to account for that. What about physical barriers? Now, you say, well, what do you mean by physical barriers? Well, you know how when you go to an assembly at school and somebody stands up at the podium and they're speaking, sometimes that podium can become a barrier. Some people may not become engaged in the presentation because the person is, for lack of better terms, hiding behind the podium. And some people hide behind the podium because they're nervous or they're uncomfortable about being in front of a group. What about if you're in the cafeteria or the auditorium and you're on the stage and there's 50 feet between you and the first person that you're speaking to? That may become a barrier because that may affect how you project. You may need a microphone, or you may need to speak very loudly. So those are just examples of physical barriers that you need to be aware of. And then finally, when we talking about impediments or obstructions, are attitudinal barriers. So attitudinal, that's an interesting word. Well, the root word is attitude, and what that basically means is, how many times have you gone to an assembly, or you go to class, or even at Scouts, there's a presentation and you're sitting there and you're like, I don't really want to be here. I'd really be outside, tying knots, or I want to go fishing, or I want to go do something other than what I'm doing right now. And when that happens, you're not paying attention to what the presenter is presenting. So that creates a barrier, because as you're trying to make your presentation and other people in the audience are seeing that there's this one member of the audience or this one individual, it has this particular attitude, it can create a barrier where they're not paying attention to you as the presenter. They're actually paying more attention to the person that's creating the attitude. Or what if that same person who doesn't want to be there is causing you problems by asking ridiculous questions? And what I mean by ridiculous questions is, let's say that you're giving a class on fire, building a fire at campsite, and this person keeps saying, yeah, but what if Zeus keeps shooting down lightning bolts and setting everything else on fire, and you can't get your fire set up at the tent because you're having to put out all these other fires? Well, that's a ridiculous question. So you may have to deal with that, and that may create a barrier to when as you're trying to give out your information, because people may laugh and joke with that person as opposed to paying attention to you. So you have to be aware of what those barriers could potentially be. And if you do have those barriers, then how can you mitigate that, or how can you address those barriers so that you can have a successful presentation and you don't get caught up in those barriers? So let's review. When we're preparing for a presentation, there's 5 basic things. You got to know the context. It's number 1. What's your role as the presenter? It's number 2. What's your intended message? It's number 3. 4, do you have a particular method or methods that you're going to use during your presentation? And 5, are there any obstructions or impediments to your presentation? So now that you have all those things, how do we kind of finalize that? So let's talk about taking those 5 things that we talked about: context, methods, impediments, what your method of your presentation is going to be, and let's look at that from a final preparation kind of thing. So, in final preparation, before you even get to developing your presentation, we talked about context, when and where. So let's talk about that. You have to consider, are you going to be standing or sitting? While you're at are you going to need electricity for your PowerPoint or your computer? Or are you going to need lights? Are you going to do it at night? What equipment or visual aids? Are you going to need a dry erase board? Are you going to need pen and paper for your participants to answer questions or fill out papers? Do you need a microphone, or are you going to be able to speak loudly? Is there going to be a podium, or what's also known as a lectern? Do you need tables and chairs? Are you following another speaker? So remember, I talked about what's your role in this. That's one of the 5 things, context, what's your role, what's the method, what impediments are you going to have, and hold on one second. And what's your intended message? Those are the 5 things. Context, what's your role, your intended message, any methods that you're going to use, and your impediment. So you want to know in your presentation exactly those 5 things. If you're going to follow another speaker, do you need time in between to set up any visual aids? Are you going to need time to change out your computer or PowerPoint? Is your PowerPoint on your computer, or is it on a thumb drive? What happens if you stick your thumb drive in there and it doesn't work? Do you have a backup? So these are some final preparations that you can make when you're looking at developing or preparing for your presentation. Now, that's the easy part. So now we actually construct your presentation. And with that being said, we need to look at the components, and there's 5 components to a presentation. So number 1 of the components is, what is the objective of your presentation? So what am I asking you? What is your goal? What are you trying to do? So in this presentation, our goal is we're asking you to teach the younger scouts exactly what the scout law means and what the scout oath means, and how that can make them a better person as they become leaders within the scout community. Number 2, what's the subject? What's the main crux of what's the meat and potatoes of your presentation? So if our goal is to make them better leaders, better sons, better daughters, better students, better brothers and sisters, so if that's our goal, how do we do that? We do that through our subject, which is the scout law and the scout oath. So we have to know what our goal is, and then we have to know what we're actually teaching. So when you figure out what you're teaching, what do you have to do? You've got to actually research it. You have to learn about it. So part of the task that you'll have is researching, what did Baden-Powell mean when he created the Scout Oath? What did he mean when he created the Scout Law? What do each of the points of the Scout Law mean? When I say a scout is helpful, or a scout is reverent, or a scout is trustworthy, what does that really mean? Not just, well, it means you're trustworthy, or you're reverent, or you're loyal, or you're helpful. What does that actually mean, and how do we apply that to our everyday life? So the third component of a presentation is your audience. Who are you presenting to? Is it young kids? You have to know their age of your audience. What is the size? Because having taught in large groups and in very small groups, that dynamic is very different. Teaching in a small group sometimes can be harder than teaching to a large group of people, and vice versa. What is the gender? Because if you're going to speak to all males, that may require you to tailor your presentation a little bit different. As I said, if you're going to do a recruiting presentation, and you were trying to recruit girls into our troop, then we want to tailor our presentation that's going to make them more interested in that. We wouldn't want to use pronouns such as he and him, because we don't want to alienate the young ladies. We want them to join and be a part of our scouting experience. So understanding what the gender is very important. Also, is our audience going to be captive, or is it going to be individuals who want to come? So what's a captive audience? A captive audience is, I grab a group of scouts and I put you down and I sit you in front of at the hall, at Scout Hall, and I say, listen, this is what we're going to talk about. And you can't get up and leave. You're captive. I'm holding you captive in here, and I'm teaching you something, or I'm presenting something to you. But if they're interested in it, that would be like you put up a flyer and say, hey, I'm going to be doing a presentation on knot tying. And then everybody that comes to that presentation wants to be there because they're interested in that. So you have to understand, is your audience going to be a captive audience, or your audience going to be it's just going to be individuals that are interested, and then they volunteer to come. So not that captive audiences are bad, it's just that there's just two types of audiences. So now that we've figured out what our goal is, we know what our subject is, and we've kind of got an idea of who our audience is going to be, and if there's going to be any barriers into that with that audience, we got to figure out, where are we going to do the presentation? Are we going to do it at a church? Are we going to do it at school? Are we going to do it where the scouts meet at? Or are we going to where our audience is at? And do we know exactly what our audience, where their where they meet, does that meet our needs for our presentation? Such as if we're doing it at, say, an arrow of light crossover, is that at a camp out, or is that inside the scout hall? Is that at a fire bowl? Because if you're doing an outside presentation, how do you do PowerPoint? Then you got to get a projector and a screen and electricity and all of these things. You have to have enough audio capability, microphones so that you can speak, so that people outside can hear you. Or are we going to do it in a place that does not have any of those luxuries, such as computer screens, computers, microphones, so forth and so on? So where are you doing your presentation, and whether it's indoor or outdoor, is obviously imperative. So that's why it's part of the 5 components. It's number 4. And then the final component of creating the actual presentation is the time. So I learned a long time ago that every presentation or every subject I teach, whether I'm teaching college or I'm teaching other law enforcement officers, I know that about an hour, 45 minutes to 50 minutes into the presentation, people start to get tired. They've been sitting for almost an hour and they need a break. So I tailor my presentations to less than an hour, because I know that that's the threshold where people start to drift off and think about other things. So you need to figure out, number 1, what time of day do you need to do your presentation? Well, how does that apply to what we're doing? Well, consider that you are going to do colors in the morning at campsite. You would need to do that early in the morning, right? So that means that you would have to prepare your lesson for dawn, or at the earliest part of the day when you're doing your when you're going to be teaching your class on colors and how colors are presented. So, but what about the length of that presentation? Now, I just told you that sometimes presentations can go so long that people become tired from sitting for such a long period of time, and then they choose to kind of tune you out. So you need to consider that, what the length of time that you're going to be teaching or presenting, and you need to tailor your presentation to that. Add some breaks in there. Add some a large amount of breaks, because you want the people to understand what you're talking about, as opposed to just hearing you speak over and over again. I mean, we've all seen the Charlie Brown TV cartoons where you hear the wah 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 wah, and nobody hears what the teacher's saying, but we hear her voice. And so we don't want that to happen. And then finally, when you're considering the time of your presentation, you got to allow for questions and answers, because you're going to give out information, and during your question and answer session, whether you have it built into your presentation or you have it at the end of your presentation, it needs to be there. So if you were going to build it into your presentation, you might teach your presentation in segments and then do mini question and answering. Or you may choose to do your whole presentation, and then at the end of your presentation, you offer some question and answering. But it's imperative that you have there, because people are going to have questions. They're not going to necessarily understand everything that you're talking about at that moment, or they may have questions about it, or they may want some clarity. So it's important that you have questions and answering, a question and answering session, and be prepared to answer those questions, because they're going to ask questions. And even if you don't know the answer, it's okay to say, listen, I don't know exactly the answer to your question, but I will find it out, and we'll get that information back to you. So let's review the components of creating an actual presentation. The objective: what are we doing this for? What's our goal? Our subject: what are we trying to teach? Who are we teaching it to? Who's our audience? Where are we teaching our presentation at? And how long is it going to take to teach? So Those are the basic 5 components of a presentation. Now that we've prepared for it, we've created it, now we actually got to do the presentation. So most people, when they get up in front of people, are very nervous. So there are 4 aspects of managing a presentation. And those aspects are, number 1, nervous. Coping with your nerves. How do we do that? Well, the first thing is you take a deep breath. Just take a deep breath, breathe. Second thing is rehearse your presentation. Talk about it before, practice. Stand in front of the mirror and practice talking as if you were going to give your presentation. Or record yourself, just like I'm creating this video presentation for you today. Record it and watch yourself, and then you can say, oh, I really could have done this a little better, or I could have done that a little better. Bring water to drink, because as you talk, your mouth is going to get dry, especially if you're new at presenting. You're going to be nervous, which your nerves, when you add that with the fact that you are doing your presentation, will create cotton mouth or dry mouth, and you'll become, your voice may crack, or it may become hard for you to speak. So bring you some water. Your water should be room temperature water, not necessarily ice cold water, and not hot water. Room temperature water. So when you drink it, it doesn't, shock you, or it doesn't, you don't create scowl on your face. Just you can just wet your throat and your tongue as you're speaking. And then finally, visualize that you're up there speaking. Imagine yourself up there giving this information, because you are the subject matter expert. You've done all the research. You've put the time in. You know what you're talking about. You're a scout. You've been a scout for many years now. You know what the scout law is. You know what the scout oath means. So visualize yourself just telling that, because you do know this information. You are the scout. You're the expert. Go out there and knock it out of the park. Create a rapport is number 2. What do I mean by creating a rapport? What I mean is be polite. Be conscious of your humor, because sometimes what we think is funny, somebody else may not think is funny. And you don't want to alienate them or make them feel uneasy about being in your presentation. Inject some empathy. So what do I mean by empathy? You want to be able to show that you can understand or relate to their issues. Now, if you're going to be making your presentation to some Cub Scouts, you can say, listen, I remember when I was a Cub Scout or a Weeblo, and I was doing these things, I was scared. I didn't want to, make fire because I was afraid it was going to get burned. But when I learned how to do it according to Boy Scouts of America, and I learned that there's a safe manner in doing that, then I wasn't scared. But I also was just as nervous as you are. And then finally, when you're dealing with creating rapport, employ what's called active listening. So when I say active listening, that can kind of be interesting. But active listening is, one of the components of active listening is when somebody asks you a question during your presentation, repeat the question back to them so that they know that you fully understand it. Here's an example. You're teaching them about fire, and you're telling them what kindling is. And they say, so is kindling a bunch of leaves? So an example of active listening might be, so what I hear you saying is, or your question to me is leaves considered kindling? And then that's an example of active listening. Or nodding your head that you're understanding, paying attention directly to them, repeating back to them what they said to you. Oh, so yeah, that makes sense. Going out and putting up your tent first is very important. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. The third component of managing your presentation is your voice and language. So what do I mean by that? Well, again, when you're knowing where you're going to be at, whether it's inside or outside, you got to have certain clarity of your voice. You have to be able to enunciate. You can't mumble. If I said, well, was this and this, presentations or this and that, you may not understand me because one, my volume is very, very low, and you can't understand the clarity. You can't hear the words that I'm trying to speak. And finally, have some variety. Talk about, use different inflections. Either, have a little bit of levity in your voice, or have some change the tone and inflection of how you speak, because you want to keep your people engaged. You want to keep your audience engaged. And then the fourth part of managing, and the final part of managing your presentation, is your position in body language. Like I said at the beginning of this presentation, there's a lectern, is the podium, okay? Be aware sometimes of where that is. That may be right in front of your PowerPoint presentation, and they can't see what you're putting on the PowerPoint. Or it may be so far off in the corner that they're looking at you as opposed to what you want them to see on the screen, or vice versa. You want them to pay attention to you as opposed to what's on the screen, and they can't because your position is on the other side of the room. Don't just stare at one person. When you're looking out in your audience, look at everybody. But if you stare at one person, you may make that person feel uncomfortable, and they may not be interested at that point. They may shut down and not want to listen. And then the other audience members might say, well, hey, I got a question, but you're locked in, laser focused on one audience member. That may not be the best method to do that. Don't fidget with things. Don't take a pen and click a pen while you're talking, because people will focus on that as opposed to what you're trying to say. Same thing with putting your hands in and out of your pockets, or going and. People will start to focus on that because they understand that you're nervous. Be careful about moving around. When you're talking, when you're giving a presentation, if you walk past somebody, so if you have a rows like in your classroom, and you walk from the front of the classroom to the back, people have to turn around to pay attention to you. And when they turn around, they may become disengaged and not paying attention to what you're saying. It's always best to stay in front of everybody so they can look directly at you. You don't want to lose them because you're moving all over the place, because you got ants in your pants. Smile. It's fun. You know what you're talking about, so get in there and enjoy it. Don't just get in there and look, oh man, I don't really want to be here. It's just kind of, it's kind of killing me to be here. Enjoy what you're doing. Put a smile on your face. Enjoy what you're talking about. And finally, have fun. Just to have fun. This is scouting. This is what being a scout is all about. You're teaching the next generation of scouts to be better scouts, to be better brothers and sisters, sons, daughters, and most importantly, leaders. So during this presentation, we talked about, number one, it's an honor to be to be asked to be a presenter. We talked about the 5 steps of preparing for a presentation. We talked about the 5 steps or the 5 components of what a presentation consists of. And then finally, we talked about the 4 steps of managing your presentation. So I hope that you've learned something. I'm going to send out a handout with all this information so that you'll have it. Besides, you'll have this video so that you can refer back to it. And as always, I'll be here to help you, or Mr. Gary, or Mr. Ken, or Miss Melanie, or Mr. Mike, or any of the other adult leaders are here to help you. So as you guys are creating this presentation and you're developing what you want to talk about, you will have all of us here for your research, for any resources or any help that you need. So I've enjoyed teaching you guys this afternoon. I've hoped that you've learned something. Again, you can always reach out to us. And remember, Scout on.